Shadows of the past. The small town of Oakview had always seemed unassuming, its quiet streets lined with modest homes, community parks, and corner stores. But beneath its surface, the town bore scars, deep divisions that festered like wounds left unattended. A place where history weighed heavily, whispered about in hushed tones, but rarely addressed outright. The relationship between Oakview's law enforcement and its predominantly black community was fraught with mistrust, built on decades of missteps, biases, and painful stories that never made the news. Officer Darren Collins, a 15-year veteran of the Oakview Police Department, rolled his patrol car through the neighborhood known as Hollow Ridge. To the department, Hollow Ridge was a hot spot, a designation based more on perception than reality. Darren had been through these streets countless times, his hardened eyes scanning for signs of trouble. Trouble to him came in the form of young men on corners, groups congregating near the basketball courts, or people walking too quickly or too slowly. He told himself he was doing his job, keeping order, maintaining peace. But deep down, Darren knew he was operating on instinct, instincts shaped by years of seeing the worst in the people he was sworn to protect. As he turned onto Marlowe Avenue, he saw an older man walking along the sidewalk. It was Pastor Elias Rivers, a figure as iconic in Hollow Ridge as the oak trees that gave the town its name. At 61, Pastor Rivers was a man of quiet strength. His broad frame, grayed beard, and kind but penetrating eyes had a way of commanding respect without a single word. He had spent decades working to heal this fractured community, preaching forgiveness while tirelessly addressing injustices. To many, he was a lifeline, a beacon of hope in a place that so often felt abandoned. Rivers was on his usual morning route, stopping to greet residents as he walked. He helped Ms. Clara with her groceries, chatted briefly with some teenagers outside the corner store, and checked in on Mr. Jenkins, a retired bus driver known for sitting on his porch with a crossword puzzle and a thermos of coffee. Darren pulled his patrol car to the side of the road, watching the pastor's every move. To him, Pastor Rivers was a wild card. He knew the man had influence, too much in Darren's view. Rivers had testified at town hall meetings about police conduct, spoken out against racial profiling, and even organized workshops for officers and residents to engage in dialogue. Darren had attended one such meeting a few years ago, reluctantly, and spent most of it stewing silently as Rivers spoke about the need for accountability. He didn't trust the pastor, but he couldn't quite say why. A few blocks away, 22-year-old Jamal King walked briskly down the sidewalk, hands shoved deep into his hoodie pockets. He had the look Darren had been trained to watch for. Head down, steps quick but purposeful, a bag slung over one shoulder. Darren's instincts kicked in. "Hey," Darren called out, rolling his window down. "Stop right there." Jamal froze, slowly turning around to face the officer. His eyes darted, his jaw tightened. "Yes, officer. Were you headed in such a hurry?" Darren stepped out of the car, his tone more accusatory than inquisitive. "I'm on my way to work," Jamal replied, his voice steady but guarded. He pointed to a name tag clipped to his bag. "I open the hardware store at 8. Let me see some ID," Darren said, approaching him. Jamal reached carefully into his pocket, retrieving his wallet and handing over his driver's license. Darren scrutinized it for longer than necessary, glancing between Jamal's face and the ID before handing it back. "All right," Darren muttered. "Move along." Jamal stared at him for a moment, a mix of frustration and resignation in his eyes, then turned and continued on his way. Darren watched him until he disappeared around the corner, a flicker of doubt creeping into his mind. Meanwhile, Pastor Rivers had reached the community park where a group of young men gathered near the basketball courts. The pastor greeted them warmly, his booming voice cutting through their laughter. "Morning, fellas. How are we today?" One of the boys, Malcolm, stepped forward. He was tall and wiry, with a quick smile and a quicker temper. "Doing good, Pastor. Just talking about that rec center project you mentioned." Rivers smiled. I like the sound of that. What ideas do you have? The group shifted closer, their earlier restlessness replaced by eager chatter. They talked about a new basketball court, tutoring programs, and job training workshops. Rivers listened intently, nodding and offering encouragement. Unbeknownst to them, Darren's patrol car had pulled into the lot. From a distance, he observed the scene, his mind already drawing conclusions. He saw a group of young black men huddled together, gesturing animatedly, and assumed the worst. He stepped out of his car, his hand instinctively resting on his belt. "All right, break it up," he called out, his voice sharp. The group turned to see Darren approaching, his posture rigid and his expression stern. The energy shifted instantly. Malcolm folded his arms, his jaw tightening. The others glanced at Pastor Rivers for guidance. "Good morning, Officer Collins," Rivers said, stepping forward. "Is there a problem?" Darren's eyes narrowed. "Yeah, there's a problem. This looks like loitering to me." Rivers didn't flinch. These young men are discussing plans for the community center renovation. They're brainstorming ways to improve their neighborhood. Darren scoffed. "Sure they are. And I'm sure it's got nothing to do with tagging walls or dealing drugs." Malcolm stepped forward, his voice rising. "We're not doing anything wrong, man." "Calm down," Darren snapped, "or I'll have to take you in for disturbing the peace." Pastor Rivers raised a hand, signaling for calm. "Officer Collins, I assure you, there's no trouble here. These are young men with bright ideas and brighter futures. All they need is support, not suspicion." "Support," Darren barked, stepping closer. "What they need is discipline. And what this neighborhood needs is fewer enablers like you." The words stung, but Rivers remained composed. "Enabling hope and dignity isn't a crime, Officer Collins. It's what keeps this community alive." The tension was palpable now, a silent crowd beginning to gather at the edges of the park, phones recording the scene. Darren's frustration boiled over. He stepped closer to Rivers, his voice dropping to a near growl. "You need to step back, Pastor, right now." Rivers stood firm, his voice steady but unyielding. "I cannot abandon these young men. If you wish to remove me, you'll have to explain why to them, to this community, and to yourself." For a moment, Darren hesitated. Then, in a flash of anger, his hand lashed out, striking Rivers across the face. The slap echoed like a gunshot, silencing the crowd. Rivers staggered but didn't fall. Slowly, he straightened, his hand brushing his cheek, where a red mark had already begun to form. The crowd erupted, gasps, shouts, and murmurs filling the air. Phones captured every second, the moment spreading across the internet before Darren could even process what he had done. Rivers looked at Darren, his eyes filled not with anger, but with a profound sadness. "Peace," he said softly, turning to the crowd. "Let there be peace." The young men surrounded Rivers, shielding him as Darren retreated to his patrol car. He drove away, his hands trembling on the steering wheel, the weight of what he had done crashing down on him. Within hours, the video was everywhere, on social media, local news, and national broadcasts. Oakview officer strikes beloved pastor became the headline of the day, sparking outrage and calls for action. The town's fragile peace was shattered, replaced by a storm of anger, fear, and demands for justice. For Pastor Rivers, the slap was more than an assault. It was a moment that laid bare the deep wounds of his community. As he touched his bruised cheek that evening, he prayed not for retribution, but for wisdom. He knew this was no longer just about him or Officer Collins. It was about something far greater, a chance to finally confront the shadows that had haunted Oakview for generations. For Darren, the incident marked the beginning of an unraveling. Alone in his home, he replayed the scene in his mind, haunted by the look in Rivers' eyes. Not anger, not hatred, just disappointment. And somehow, that was worse. Neither man knew it yet, but the events of that day would set in motion a journey neither had anticipated. A journey toward reckoning, redemption, and the possibility of change. a line drawn in the sand. The fallout from Officer Darren Collins' actions came swiftly, like a storm rolling in from the horizon. By nightfall, the video of him striking Pastor Elias Rivers had amassed hundreds of thousands of views, igniting a firestorm of anger and debate. Social media was flooded with hashtags like #JusticeForRivers and #EndPoliceViolence, alongside footage showing the pastor's calm response juxtaposed against Darren's active aggression. At City Hall, Mayor Linda Carver called an emergency meeting with Chief of Police Paul Gaines. The tension in the mayor's office was palpable, the kind of unease that precedes irreversible decisions. "This isn't just a PR nightmare, Paul," Mayor Carver said, pacing the room. "This is a breaking point. Our town has been teetering on the edge for years, and now it's going to fall." Chief Gaines, a stoic man in his 60s with a silver mustache and a reputation for keeping his department insulated from public scrutiny, folded his arms. "Darren's been with us for 15 years. He's a good officer." "Is he?" Carver stopped mid-step, fixing him with a sharp look. "Because what I saw in that video wasn't good policing. It was an officer losing control. And now our phones are ringing off the hook with complaints. He's under a lot of pressure." "We all are," Carver interrupted, her voice rising. "But we don't get to slap a man in front of half the neighborhood. Especially not Elias Rivers, of all people." The mention of Rivers' name hung in the air, a reminder of the pastor's standing in the community. Gaines sighed heavily. "What do you want me to do?" "For starters," Carver said, "put Collins on administrative leave, effective immediately, and issue a public statement, one that acknowledges what happened and outlines a plan to address it. The people need to see that we're taking this seriously." Gaines frowned, but nodded. He wasn't thrilled about throwing one of his officers to the wolves, but even he could see there was no alternative. Meanwhile, Pastor Rivers sat in his modest living room, surrounded by members of his congregation. The air was heavy with a mix of concern and anger. Malcolm was pacing back and forth, his energy barely contained. "Pastor, you can't just let this slide," he said, stopping to face Rivers. "That cop humiliated you in front of everyone. People are ready to march. Let's organize a protest and shut down City Hall until they fire him." Other voices in the room chimed in, echoing Malcolm's sentiments, but Rivers held up a hand, and the room quieted. "I understand your anger," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I don't blame you for feeling this way. But anger alone won't fix what's broken in this town. It won't bring justice. It won't bring peace." Malcolm shook his head. "You always talk about peace, Pastor, but where has it gotten us? People are still getting harassed, still getting profiled. And now this." He gestured toward the faint bruise on Rivers' cheek. Rivers leaned forward in his chair, his eyes meeting Malcolm's. "Peace isn't the absence of conflict, son. It's the presence of justice. And true justice requires more than shouting and demanding. It requires action. Thoughtful, deliberate action." The room was silent for a moment before Rivers continued. "We will respond, but we'll do it in a way that invites change, not just punishment. A protest is fine, but it must be peaceful, and we must go beyond the streets. We need dialogue, policy changes, and accountability." Malcolm exhaled sharply, his frustration evident, but he nodded reluctantly. "All right, Pastor, but people are angry. You'll need to speak to them soon." "I will," Rivers promised. Darren sat alone in his dimly lit living room, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his chest. His wife, Erin, had taken their 2 children to her mother's house, saying they needed space to breathe. Darren hadn't argued. He understood her anger, even if it stung. His phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from his partner, Officer Lisa Cheng. "Lisa, we need to talk. Call me." Darren hesitated, then picked up the phone and dialed. Lisa answered on the second ring. "Darren," she said, her tone tight. "You okay?" He let out a bitter laugh. "Do I sound okay, Lisa? My career is probably over, My family's falling apart, and half the country thinks I'm a racist thug." Lisa was silent for a moment. "You messed up. Big time. Thanks for the reminder. I'm not saying it to rub it in," she said, "but you need to own it. What you did wasn't justifiable, and you know it." Darren leaned back on the couch, staring at the ceiling. "I lost control. He made me feel so." "What?" Challenged. Threatened. Lisa's voice softened. "Darren, Pastor Rivers wasn't a threat to you. He's never been a threat to anyone. You need to ask yourself why you reacted the way you did." Her words stung because they were true. Darren had always prided himself on being in control, on being fair. But that control had slipped, revealing something ugly beneath. He didn't want to confront it, but he knew he couldn't avoid it forever. "Thanks, Lisa," he said quietly. "I'll figure it out." "You better," she replied, "because this isn't just about you anymore. It's about all of us." The next morning, Hollow Ridge woke to the sight of flyers plastered on telephone poles, storefronts, and community boards. They read, "Stand with Pastor Rivers. Demand justice. Peaceful protest at City Hall. Saturday at noon." By midday, the buzz around the protest had reached every corner of town. Some praised the pastor's call for peace, while others criticized him for not demanding harsher consequences for Darren. The community was divided, but the turnout on Saturday was undeniable. Hundreds gathered in front of City Hall, holding signs that read "Justice for Rivers," "End police violence," and "Accountability now." Pastor Rivers stood at the front of the crowd, flanked by community leaders and activists. He raised his hands for silence, and the murmurs of the crowd died down. "My friends," he began, his voice carrying over the sea of people, "what happened to me was wrong. But this moment is not about me. It's about us. It's about a system that allows prejudice to fester unchecked. It's about the fear and mistrust that divides us. And it's about the opportunity we have, right now, to demand better." The crowd erupted in applause and cheers. Rivers waited for the noise to subside before continuing. "Justice is not revenge," he said. "It is accountability. It is change. And it is forgiveness, not for their sake, but for ours." In the crowd, Malcolm crossed his arms, still skeptical but moved by the pastor's words. As Rivers spoke, Darren watched from a distance, sitting in his car parked at the edge of the square. He couldn't bring himself to step out, to face the crowd, but he couldn't look away either. Rivers' words pierced through his defenses, forcing him to confront the question he'd been avoiding since that fateful day. What kind of man am I? By the time the protest ended, the town had reached a boiling point. The police department announced an independent investigation into Darren's conduct, while activists called for broader reforms. At the heart of it all was Pastor Rivers, a man caught between his community's anger and his unwavering belief in redemption. For Darren, the road ahead was unclear. He knew he couldn't undo what he had done, but perhaps, just perhaps, there was a way to make amends, a way to face his demons and become the man he once believed himself to be. Cracks in the foundation. The days following the protest were a blur of tension, reflection, and simmering unrest. In Hollow Ridge, the community buzzed with conversations about what had transpired and what was to come. Pastor Elias Rivers had emerged as a symbol of resilience, his voice calling for measured, meaningful change. Yet, not everyone agreed with his approach. The younger generation, led by figures like Malcolm, demanded action that went beyond peaceful protests and heartfelt speeches. At the center of the storm was Officer Darren Collins, a man grappling with the consequences of a single moment of anger that had unraveled his career, his reputation, and the trust of those closest to him. The department divided. Within the Oakview Police Department, the atmosphere was thick with unease. Darren's administrative leave had sent ripples through the ranks. Some officers rallied behind him, seeing him as a scapegoat for broader societal frustrations. Others distanced themselves, unwilling to defend actions that had become indefensible in the court of public opinion. Detective Lisa Cheng, Darren's longtime partner, found herself caught in the middle. Over the years, she had come to respect Darren's skills as an officer, but the incident had shaken her confidence in him. During a precinct meeting, Captain Paul Gaines addressed the elephant in the room. His expression was grim as he stood before the assembled officers. "We're facing a crisis," he began. "Not just a PR crisis, but a crisis of trust. The community we serve is demanding answers and changes. This department will cooperate fully with the independent investigation into Officer Collins' actions. But let me be clear, this is bigger than one incident." Murmurs rippled through the room, some of agreement, others of dissent. "We've been given a choice," Gaines continued. "We can either see this as an attack on us, or we can see it as an opportunity to rebuild trust. I suggest we choose the latter." Detective Mark Halstead, one of Darren's vocal supporters, crossed his arms. "With all due respect, Captain, it feels like we're throwing Collins under the bus. He's not the first officer to lose his temper, and he won't be the last." Lisa turned sharply to him. "It's not about losing his temper, Mark. It's about what that temper revealed. If we don't deal with the underlying biases in this department, incidents like this will keep happening." Halstead's lips tightened, but he didn't respond. The room fell into a heavy silence. A fractured home. At home, Darren found himself alone more often than not. His wife, Erin, had taken their children to her mother's house indefinitely. Their conversations were clipped and tense, punctuated by long silences. "I don't know if I can do this, Darren," Erin said during one phone call. "The kids are scared. I'm scared. And you." She paused, her voice thick with emotion. "You're not the man I married. I don't know who you are anymore." Darren's voice cracked as he replied, "I don't know who I am either." That night, he sat at the dining table, staring at a stack of unopened letters from the department, the town, and even a few hate groups who had taken an interest in his case. One envelope, addressed in neat handwriting, caught his eye. It was from Pastor Elias Rivers. The note was short but impactful. "Dear Officer Collins, I pray this letter finds you in a moment of reflection. I know these days must be difficult for you and your family. Please know that while I condemn your actions, I do not condemn you. There is a difference, and I believe you know that. I remain open to meeting with you, not to assign blame, but to seek understanding. Redemption is a journey, and it begins with the first step. Yours in faith, Elias Rivers." Darren read the letter 3 times, his emotions a confusing tangle of anger, shame, and something else, something that felt uncomfortably like hope. The community fractures. Across town, the younger activists were growing impatient. Malcolm had gathered a group at the community center, where frustration filled the room like a storm cloud. "Pastor Rivers keeps talking about peace and dialogue," Malcolm said, pacing the room. "But how many dialogues have we had? How many times have we turned the other cheek? And what's changed?" Jasmine, a local teacher who had joined the movement, stood up. "You're right that we need more than words, Malcolm, but we can't let anger lead us. If we start tearing things down, we lose the moral high ground." Malcolm gestured emphatically. "The moral high ground hasn't done anything for us. We're still harassed, still profiled, still treated like criminals." The room buzzed with agreement, but there were also murmurs of dissent. The division was clear. Some wanted immediate, disruptive action, while others believed in following Pastor Rivers' example. A meeting of opposites. 3 days later, Darren finally found himself walking into the Beacon of Hope, Pastor Rivers' church. The building was simple but warm, with sunlight streaming through stained glass windows. Rivers stood near the altar, a calm presence in the quiet space. "Officer Collins," Rivers said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming." Darren hesitated before shaking it. "Pastor, I don't know why I'm here." "Maybe you're here because you're ready to face the truth," Rivers replied, gesturing for Darren to sit. "Or maybe you're here because you feel you have no other choice. Either way, I'm glad you came." They sat across from each other, the silence stretching until Darren finally spoke. I've been doing this job for 15 years. I thought I knew what it meant to protect and serve. But now, he trailed off, shaking his head. Now I'm not so sure. Doubt is the beginning of wisdom, Rivers said gently. What do you doubt? Darren stared at his hands. Everything. I look back at my career, and I see the patterns, the stops, the assumptions, the way I've treated people without even realizing it. And then there's what I did to you. He couldn't finish the sentence, his voice choked with emotion. Recognizing those patterns is the first step, Rivers said. But recognition isn't enough. What will you do with this knowledge? Darren looked up, his eyes raw. I don't know how to change, and even if I do, I don't think anyone will forgive me. Forgiveness isn't something you earn, Darren. It's something given freely. But accountability, that's where your work begins. They talked for hours, Darren opening up about his upbringing, the pressures of the job, and the internalized biases he was only beginning to confront. Rivers listened without judgment, offering guidance but not absolution. As Darren left the church that evening, he felt lighter, though the road ahead still loomed long and uncertain. Seeds of change. The next morning, Pastor Rivers held a meeting with community leaders and activists, including Malcolm. He proposed a new initiative, a series of truth and reconciliation forums where residents and law enforcement could share their experiences and begin rebuilding trust. Malcolm was skeptical. You really think they'll show up, Pastor? That they'll listen? They might not all come, Rivers admitted. But those who do will set the tone for what's possible. Change begins with those willing to sit in the discomfort of truth. The room was quiet, the weight of the moment settling over them. Finally, Malcolm nodded. All right, let's try it. For Darren, the days that followed were a test of endurance. He attended his first therapy session, a requirement set by the department, and began reading the materials Pastor Rivers had recommended. It was slow, painful work, but for the first time, he felt like he was moving forward rather than standing still. At the forums, Darren sat in the back, listening as residents shared stories of harassment, fear, and pain. Each story felt like a punch to the gut, but he forced himself to stay, to hear them all. For the first time, he understood the weight of the uniform he had worn for so long, not as a shield, but as a symbol of the harm he had helped perpetuate. The cracks in Oakview's foundation were beginning to show, but as the community faced its truths head-on, something unexpected began to grow in those spaces. The possibility of healing. Bridges in the rubble. The whispers of change in Oakview were faint at first, like the tentative opening notes of a symphony. In the days following the first community forum, the town found itself navigating uncharted waters. Long simmering tensions had been thrust into the open, and while the discussions were painful, they carried with them the possibility of transformation. For Pastor Elias Rivers, the forums were only the beginning. His efforts to bring the community and law enforcement together were met with both hope and resistance. Some saw his vision as naive, a futile attempt to heal wounds too deep to ever fully mend. Others saw it as necessary, a path toward something better than the cyclical resentment that had defined Oakview for decades. For Officer Darren Collins, the forums were a daily exercise in humility and reckoning. Sitting among the people he once regarded with suspicion, he was forced to confront their truths and his own. The turning point. Darren stepped into the community center's main hall on the evening of the second forum, his stomach tight with anxiety. The room was already filling with residents, their conversations buzzing like static electricity. He recognized faces from the neighborhood. Shop owners, parents, teenagers, even Malcolm, who sat in the back with arms crossed and a skeptical expression. Darren hesitated by the door, unsure if he should take a seat or retreat. A voice interrupted his internal struggle. You planning to stand there all night, or are you gonna join us? He turned to see Malik, a high school counselor and one of Pastor Rivers' closest allies. Malik's tone wasn't hostile, but it carried an edge that told Darren he wasn't off the hook. I wasn't sure where to sit, Darren admitted. Malik gestured toward the circle of chairs forming in the center of the room. "Sit anywhere. But if you're here, you better be ready to listen." Darren nodded and made his way to an empty chair. The circle was intentionally designed to be intimate, free of barriers like tables or podiums. It was a space for raw honesty, where vulnerability was both expected and necessary. Pastor Rivers began the evening with a brief prayer, his calm voice grounding the group. "Tonight, we are here to share stories, not to argue. To listen, not to defend. Only by hearing each other can we begin to understand." The first speaker was an elderly woman named Clara, whose trembling hands clutched a photograph of her grandson. "His name was Isaiah," she said, her voice breaking. "He was only 16 when he was stopped by police. They said he matched the description of a robbery suspect. He was on his way home from band practice, carrying his trumpet case. That night, he came home shaking, crying, asking me why they treated him like a criminal. 3 years later, he's gone now. An accident, they say. But I know that night changed him forever." Darren's chest tightened as she spoke. He thought of the countless stop and frisk encounters he had initiated over the years. How many Isaiahs had he unknowingly affected? How many lives had been shaped by his assumptions? Other voices followed, each story layering more weight onto Darren's conscience. A young mother spoke of the fear she felt every time her teenage son left the house. A middle-aged man shared his humiliation at being handcuffed in front of his children for a minor traffic violation. The air grew heavier with every word. Finally, Pastor Rivers turned his attention to Darren. "Officer Collins, would you like to share your story tonight?" The room fell silent, all eyes on him. Darren swallowed hard. He faltered, unsure of how to begin. "I'm not sure what to say." "Start with the truth," Rivers said gently. Darren took a deep breath. "The truth is, I'd spent most of my career thinking I was doing the right thing. I believed I was protecting people, keeping the streets safe. But now I see that I was part of the problem. I let my biases guide my decisions. I judged people without knowing them, without seeing them as human beings. And what I did to Pastor Rivers..." He paused, his voice cracking. "What I did was unforgivable." The silence stretched, heavy and expectant. It was Malcolm who finally broke it, his voice sharp and direct. "You're right. It was unforgivable. So, what are you going to do about it?" Malcolm's challenge. Malcolm's question echoed in Darren's mind long after the forum ended. It was a question he couldn't escape. What was he going to do about it? Apologies and forums were a start, but they weren't enough. The damage he had done, to individuals, to the community, and to himself, required more than words. The next morning, Darren met with Captain Paul Gaines in his office. The older man regarded him with a mixture of wariness and frustration. "You're not making this easy for me, Darren," Gaines said, leaning back in his chair. "The department is under fire, and half the officers think I'm throwing you to the wolves." "I'm not asking for protection," Darren replied. "I'm asking for the chance to make this right." Gaines raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan to do that?" Darren hesitated, then said, "I want to help with community outreach. I want to work with Pastor Rivers and his team. Maybe if people see me trying to change, they'll start to believe that the department can change too." Gaines studied him for a long moment. "You realize this won't fix everything, right? The damage is done." "I know," Darren said, "but it's a start. Building the bridge." Over the following weeks, Darren threw himself into community initiatives, working closely with Pastor Rivers, Malik, and other local leaders. He volunteered at the youth center, mentoring kids and teaching workshops on conflict resolution. He attended every forum, not as a representative of the police department, but as a member of the community seeking redemption. At first, the reception was cold. Residents were wary of his presence, their skepticism palpable. But as time passed, Darren began to earn their trust, not through grand gestures, but through consistent, humble effort. One afternoon, while helping paint a mural at the community center, Darren found himself working alongside Malcolm. The younger man hadn't spoken to him since the forum, but now he broke the silence. "Why are you doing this?" Malcolm asked, his tone still guarded. Darren paused, his brush hovering over the wall. "Because I need to be better, not for my career or for how people see me, but because it's the right thing to do." Malcolm stared at him for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Just don't screw it up." Seeds of progress. The transformation wasn't limited to Darren. Inspired by the forums and the growing collaboration between residents and law enforcement, Oakview began to change in tangible ways. The police department implemented mandatory bias training, and a civilian oversight board was established to hold officers accountable. The town's first joint community police basketball tournament was held at Jefferson Park, drawing hundreds of residents. Darren, initially hesitant to participate, was encouraged by Malik to join a team. To his surprise, the experience was both humbling and healing. Linda, Darren's wife, began to see the changes in him. She and the kids returned home, cautiously optimistic that the man they loved was finally confronting the darkness that had plagued him. A moment of grace. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Darren stood outside, the beacon of hope. He had come to thank Pastor Rivers for everything, for his guidance, his forgiveness, and his unwavering belief in the possibility of change. Inside, Rivers greeted him with a warm smile. "How are you feeling?" "Officer Collins." "Call me Darren," he said. And honestly, for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm heading in the right direction. Rivers nodded. The journey is far from over, but every step matters. They sat in the quiet church, the stained glass casting colors across the pews. Darren felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years, a peace born not from the absence of conflict, but from the hard, necessary work of transformation. As Oakview continued its journey toward healing, Darren realized that change wasn't about erasing the past. It was about acknowledging it, learning from it, and building something better in its place. The cracks in Oakview's foundation were still visible, but in their place, bridges were beginning to form. The cost of redemption. Oakview was changing, but change came slowly and unevenly, like a tide that advanced with each wave but receded just enough to test the resolve of those waiting on shore. The forums, community outreach programs, and visible efforts of people like Pastor Elias Rivers and Officer Darren Collins had ignited hope, but they also uncovered deeper rifts. For every step forward, there were whispers of skepticism, echoes of resentment, and pockets of resistance. For Darren, the cost of his redemption journey was beginning to show, not only in the wary glances from his fellow officers, but also in the toll it took on his own identity. He had once been proud of his uniform, seeing it as a symbol of his purpose. Now, every time he looked at it hanging in his closet, he felt a complicated mix of shame and determination. The officers' divide. The Oakview Police Department had always operated as a brotherhood, but Darren's actions and subsequent efforts at reconciliation created cracks in that solidarity. Some officers saw him as a traitor, his cooperation with the forums and public criticisms of departmental culture painting a target on his back. One morning, Darren walked into the precinct to find his locker defaced. Scrawled across the metal door in red marker were the words, "Traitor." He stared at it for a long moment before reaching for a cloth to wipe it away. Detective Lisa Cheng appeared beside him, holding a can of disinfectant. "You know who did it?" she asked quietly. Darren shook his head. "Does it matter?" Lisa sighed. "It matters if they start doing more than writing words." He nodded but didn't respond. The truth was, he wasn't sure what hurt more, the hostility of his colleagues or the knowledge that he had spent years upholding the same toxic culture that now turned against him. Malcolm's challenge revisited. Malcolm hadn't entirely warmed to Darren, but he couldn't deny the man's persistence. Darren showed up at every community event, volunteered at the youth center twice a week, and even helped organize a neighborhood cleanup initiative. Yet Malcolm remained wary, his skepticism fueled by years of broken promises from people in power. During one particularly tense forum, Malcolm voiced what many others in the room were thinking. "So, Officer Collins," he began, leaning forward in his chair, "you've been doing a lot of good lately. But here's the thing. We're all waiting for the other shoe to drop. What happens when the department decides you're more trouble than you're worth? Or when it gets too hard for you to keep showing up?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Darren, who sat with his hands clasped tightly in his lap. He took a deep breath before responding. "You're right to question me," Darren said. "I've earned your mistrust. But I'm not here to win points or prove anything to anyone. I'm here because I need to be. Because I want to be. If I fail, that's on me, not on you. But I promise you, Malcolm, I won't stop trying." Malcolm studied him for a long moment, then gave a curt nod. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. The department investigates. While Darren was navigating his personal transformation, the independent investigation into his conduct continued to unfold. Investigators combed through his records, reviewing every stop, every complaint, every instance where his actions had been questioned. Darren knew the results could lead to his termination, or worse, but he also knew it was necessary. During one particularly grueling interview, the lead investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Regina Cross, asked him pointedly, "Officer Collins, do you believe you were racially biased in your policing practices?" The question hung in the air like a weight. Darren hesitated, then nodded. "Yes," he said. "I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, I see the patterns. I see how my assumptions guided my actions, and I see how those actions harmed people." Regina's expression didn't change, but she scribbled something in her notebook. "And do you believe you can continue to serve this community effectively?" Darren swallowed hard. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I'd like the chance to try." Pastor Rivers' quiet battles. While Darren faced scrutiny from within the department, Pastor Rivers was navigating his own challenges. His decision to extend grace to Darren and work collaboratively with the police had earned him both praise and criticism. Some in the community saw him as a peacemaker, while others accused him of being too soft, too willing to forgive. One evening, as Rivers was locking up the church, a young woman named Tasha approached him. She was one of Malcolm's closest allies, known for her fiery speeches and uncompromising stance on justice. "Pastor," she began, "I respect you. I really do. But I don't understand how you can work with him. With any of them." Rivers paused, studying her face. "Because change doesn't happen in isolation, Tasha. It happens when we face the people who've wronged us and demand better from them. And from ourselves." Tasha frowned. "But what if they don't change? What if all this effort is for nothing?" Rivers placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then we keep trying. Because the alternative, giving up, isn't an option." A test of resolve. One night, Darren received a call that would test the very foundation of his transformation. A fight had broken out at a local diner, and several people had been detained. Among them was Jamal, the young man Darren had stopped and questioned on the day of the incident with Pastor Rivers. When Darren arrived at the station, Jamal was sitting in a holding cell, his face bruised and his expression hardened. Darren approached the cell slowly, unsure of how to begin. "Jamal," he said, his voice low. "What happened?" Jamal didn't look at him. "What do you care?" Darren sighed, pulling up a chair. "I care because I see you, and because I owe you." Jamal turned his head, his eyes narrowing. "You owe me? What does that even mean?" "It means I was wrong about you," Darren said. "And I don't expect you to forgive me. But I'm here now. Whatever you need, I'll do my best to help." Jamal stared at him for a long moment, then muttered, "I need you to get me out of here." Darren nodded. "Consider it done." Steps toward the future. The incident with Jamal marked a turning point for Darren. He realized that redemption wasn't just about grand gestures or public displays. It was about showing up in the moments that mattered. It was about being present, being accountable, and being human. Meanwhile, Oakview itself was beginning to change in tangible ways. The forums continued to grow, attracting not only residents, but also officers willing to confront their own biases. The Civilian Oversight Board began reviewing policies and making recommendations, some of which were already being implemented. And yet, the work was far from over. A shared purpose. 1 year after the incident that had set everything in motion, Oakview held its first Day of Unity, a town-wide event celebrating progress while acknowledging the work that remained. There were speeches, performances, and a dedication ceremony for the newly renovated community center. Pastor Rivers and Darren stood side by side as the ribbon was cut, the crowd cheering. Malcolm was there too, watching from a distance. He still wasn't entirely convinced of Darren's transformation, but he had come to respect the man's persistence. As the sun set over Oakview, Rivers turned to Darren. "How do you feel?" Darren smiled faintly, like I'd finally started to earn the right to be here. Rivers nodded, and the journey continues. Together, they watched as the people of Oakview, young and old, black and white, police and residents, began to mingle, talk, and laugh. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was a start. The long road forward. A year after the confrontation between Pastor Elias Rivers and Officer Darren Collins, the town of Oakview had transformed into a crucible of change. The scars of the past hadn't disappeared, but they had become part of the town's story, a reminder of the mistakes that couldn't be repeated and the courage it took to confront them. Darren stood on the edge of Jefferson Park, watching the morning light filter through the trees. Children played on the new playground. Teenagers shot hoops at the refurbished basketball court, and parents chatted as they sipped coffee from local food trucks. The community center loomed nearby, freshly painted and bustling with activity. It was the first day of Oakview's inaugural Pathways to Justice Summit, a collaboration between local leaders, law enforcement, and national advocates for community reform. What began as a small series of town forums had grown into something much larger, an event that put Oakview on the map as a model for reconciliation and reform. Darren's new role. As part of his ongoing efforts to repair trust and redefine his role in the community, Darren had taken on a position as a community liaison officer. His duties were less about patrolling and more about bridge building, mentoring youth, organizing events, and working alongside residents to identify and address issues. The position wasn't without its challenges. Some officers still view him as a traitor, while others grudgingly acknowledged the necessity of his work. In the community, trust was building, but it was far from universal. Every step Darren took felt like walking a tightrope, balancing between redemption and resistance. At the summit, Darren led a workshop titled Lessons Learned, a personal journey from bias to accountability. The room was packed. Residents, officers, and even visitors from other towns eager to learn from Oakview's example. Standing at the front of the room, Darren felt the familiar knot of anxiety in his stomach. He glanced at Pastor Rivers, seated in the front row, who gave him a reassuring nod. "I used to think I was a good officer because I followed the rules," Darren began. "But I've learned that following the rules isn't enough if the rules themselves are broken, or if you interpret them through the lens of your own biases." He paused, scanning the room. "A year ago, I made a terrible mistake. I struck a man who had done nothing but stand up for his community. That moment forced me to confront not only my actions, but the beliefs and fears that had shaped them. It wasn't easy, and it still isn't. But acknowledging the problem was the first step toward change." The audience was quiet, their attention rapt. Darren continued, sharing stories of his own reckoning and the steps he'd taken to address his biases. Therapy, training, listening to the community. He didn't sugarcoat his journey, admitting to moments of doubt and setbacks along the way. "I'm not here to tell you I've fixed everything," he concluded. "I'm here to tell you that change is possible, but it requires humility, accountability, and a willingness to sit in the discomfort of your own truth." Malcolm's shift. Malcolm sat in the back of the room, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Over the past year, his relationship with Darren had shifted from hostility to cautious respect. He still wasn't sure he trusted the man entirely, but he couldn't deny that Darren's actions had been consistent. More importantly, Darren had listened. To Malcolm, to the community, to the voices that had been silenced for too long. After the workshop, Malcolm approached Darren as the room emptied out. "Not bad," Malcolm said, his tone grudgingly complimentary. Darren raised an eyebrow. "That's high praise coming from you." Malcolm smirked, but his expression grew serious. "Look, I'm not saying I trust you 100% yet, but I see you trying, and that counts for something." "It means a lot to hear that," Darren replied. "But I know trust isn't given, it's earned. I'm in this for the long haul." Malcolm nodded, extending a hand. Darren hesitated, then shook it, the gesture marking a tentative but meaningful truce. Tensions resurfaced. Even as progress was being made, Oakview remained a town grappling with its past. During the summit's second day, news broke of an incident in a neighboring town. A young black man had been fatally shot by police during a routine traffic stop. The tragedy reignited anger and fear, and protests quickly spread to Oakview. At a hastily called town meeting, emotions ran high. Residents voiced their frustration, fear, and grief, demanding to know how Oakview could ensure such a tragedy wouldn't happen within its borders. "We've come a long way," one woman said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But it only takes one bad decision, one act of prejudice, to destroy everything we've built." Pastor Rivers stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "You're right," he said. "Change is fragile, but it's also resilient, if we nurture it. What happened in that neighboring town reminds us why we must continue this work, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who looks to Oakview as a beacon of hope." Darren spoke next, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "I know what it's like to make a bad decision that changes lives, and I know how hard it is to rebuild after that. We can't control everything, but we can control how we respond, by holding each other accountable, by speaking out, and by never becoming complacent." A community united. In the days that followed, Oakview's residents organized a vigil for the victim and his family, inviting members of the neighboring town to attend. The event was a powerful display of solidarity, with speakers from both communities sharing their stories and calling for justice. Darren stood in the crowd, listening intently. He noticed Malcolm near the front, holding a sign that read "Justice and Accountability for All." For the first time, Darren felt like he truly belonged, not as a uniformed officer, but as a member of the community. A moment of reflection. On the final night of the summit, Pastor Rivers invited Darren to the church for a quiet moment of reflection. They sat in the front pew, the soft glow of candlelight illuminating the space. "You've come a long way, Darren," Rivers said, his tone warm but serious. "But the work never ends." "I know," Darren replied, "and I'm okay with that. For the first time, I feel like I'm doing something that matters." Rivers smiled. "You are. And so is this town. We're proving that even in the face of pain and division, reconciliation is possible." As they sat in silence, the sounds of the community drifted through the open windows. Children laughing, voices chatting, the hum of life continuing. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for Oakview, progress was enough. A legacy of change. The summit ended with a commitment to continue the work that had begun in Oakview. Grants were secured to expand the community center's programs, and plans were made to implement similar forums in neighboring towns. Darren was invited to join a statewide task force on police reform, a role he accepted with a mix of apprehension and determination. As he walked home that evening, Darren felt the weight of his journey, not as a burden, but as a responsibility. He thought of Pastor Rivers, Malcolm, the forums, and the countless voices that had guided him along the way. Change wasn't a destination, Darren realized. It was a process, a continuous, collective effort to build something better. And as long as he was part of that effort, he knew he was on the right path.